probably a good thing, and it reflects what is without question a much higher priority placed on Turkey, on trying to get Turkey right in this administration today, and not just in government, but today in Washington than was the case 5 years ago. I was at a sort of a think tank kind of a thing last week, and one of the participants remarked that who sort of works on Turkey, Europe, Russia, Eurasia issues, kind of a little bit the same basket that I do, I guess. Anyway, this person said, you know, when we call and we try to arrange a meeting or a conference on Russia, we're lucky to get 10 or 15 people in the room. When we call a meeting or a conference on Turkey, we're turning them away. People are trying to figure it out. And that multiplicity of voices that you have, for better or worse, I think is a reflection of it. The third point I'd make, and this doesn't really speak directly to your question, but is something that concerns me as a practitioner, is the relatively thin bench within the U.S. government. At my embassy in Ankara, I think we had maybe 3 people that I would call recidivists. People who had come back to Turkey for a second time. In diplomatic life, at any embassy or diplomatic mission, the people that are the most valuable to you are those that have a little bit of perspective that goes back to some other period. In other words, those who are on their second or third tour in Turkey, and then they go off somewhere else, but then they come back. And that made for a pretty thin bench. There were too many people, frankly speaking, like me, who were trying to figure out Turkey for the first time, and not enough recidivists. Now, we've been working our way through a couple of recidivists, Jim Jeffrey and Frank Ricciardoni, both people with long and extensive experience in Turkey. You can judge for yourself, you know, how successful they have been. I mean, clearly, it's a challenging job. Both outstanding diplomats, bringing a lot of experience. I don't know, actually, I don't think there is in the pipeline another person like that who would be going back to Turkey for the 3rd or 4th time, who's sort of ready in career terms, and that's not good. When I joined the Foreign Service in 1979, and for the previous 3 or 4 years, there had been a conscious effort to develop a cadre of specialists on the Soviet Union. And the model, that late 1970s model, was very specifically the effort that the State Department instituted in the early 1930s to develop a cadre of Soviet specialists that produced people like George Kennan and Llewellyn Thompson and Chip Bolin. And the feeling was, you know, we need to do that again, and we need a large cadre so that 10 or 15, 20, 30 years later, those who come to be ambassador, deputy chief of mission, political counselor, economic counselor, and so forth, that they are people who served there before. And if I were at the State Department, especially if I had anything to do with personnel, I would be working hard to try within the ranks of the U.S. government, in the diplomatic service and in the analytical agencies that support our diplomacy, to develop a kind of cadre of Turkey specialists and Arab specialists and China and so on and so forth. I think that's failing to do that will aggravate problems that the United States has had in understanding Turkey over the years. Yeah.
Hello, Olden is from Bahçeşehir University.
Can we just turn those off? They're not working properly. Then.
Well, in recent days, Turkish government and population are discussing about the new constitution and presidential for Turkey. So do you think the presidential system is suitable for Turkey?
I don't know. Turkey's had the parliamentary system that it has had for a long time. Changing to a presidential system is a big change. And one that has a number of implications, presents a number of potential difficulties that I think people are going to want, and Turks are going to want to have a long conversation about before going down that road. At the end of the day, it's a conversation for Turks. It's not so much a conversation for others.
I was a little curious about the WikiLeaks incident, and how did you feel about, especially the discussion built around the Ankara wires, most of the wires that came.
Yeah. Well, diplomacy, like a number of professions, is one that requires a certain level of confidentiality to get your work done. And you think of lawyers, you think of doctors, you don't expect your medical reports to become public. Journalists write articles, but they sure don't want all their notes about specific conversations being put in the newspapers. And so I think what has happened is the fact of the leak by the providing of all these documents apparently by this Army private, or allegedly by this Army private, and their release thanks to the WikiLeaks organization and Julian Assange, I think it's extremely irresponsible and unhelpful and damaging, not only to American diplomacy and American interests around the world. I think it's damaging to diplomacy generally, because what happened to us probably won't happen in the same way to somebody else, but the same problem can exist for any of a variety of diplomatic services, including the troops. Having looked back over the relatively limited number of cables that I've seen that are actual cable or look like actual cables, and I would say there may have been a little bit of tinkering with the text, although I probably don't want to get into that too much. But looking back over the work as a whole, whether it's in Turkey or generally speaking, I'm pretty proud of the work that got done. Our job is to report what we see and what we hear. It's not exactly intelligence collection, but it's collection of information and insight that doesn't amount to U.S. policy. It amounts to input for U.S. policymakers and work that's done to help policymakers understand what's going on and have a reasonably full. And I think, so as I look back on things that shall we say, that I personally wrote, certainly, I'm pretty proud of it. And I think, but I come back to my main point. None of us wrote these messages expecting that any of it would become public in the course of our professional lives. What you see certainly does not represent the sum total of reporting that came from Ankara or from any other post, because a whole set of topics and a whole set of conversations just are not reflected in what went into the database that Private Manning allegedly made available.
Any more questions? Juliet.
Hi, I'm Juliette Tolain from the University of Delaware. I have a question regarding Europe, and it has been an official policy from the US for more than a decade to support Turkey's bid to the EU membership. And obviously things have changed a lot in more than 10 years. Where do you see US policy on that standing now?
Well, the United States has supported Turkey's EU accession for a lot longer than 10 years. It goes back really about 4 decades and spans both parties and presidents and from a range of individuals. I don't see that changing, at least not as long as Turkey and the EU have as their goal, as their stated goal, bringing Turkey into the European Union. That is the point of making Turkey a candidate country, is to become a member. There's not some other goal that the EU has proclaimed or that Turkey has proclaimed for itself, at least insofar as those relations are concerned. And I don't really see any particular diminution of U.S. interest or activism. The most active role we played was in the run-up to the decision to formally begin talks when Secretary Rice and President Bush in sort of September, October 2005 were very, very, very active. From, I mean, Europeans would say too active and too pushy on this subject. With the negotiations underway, the U.S. role becomes a little bit different because the particulars are not, there are issues that concern us, but it's a bilateral conversation that we're not and can't exactly be a party to. I think on the broader question, which you didn't ask, but the broader question of Turkey and the EU, I think that this is a complicated process whose outcome is probably uncertain at this point. The dynamic is almost one that's designed to be difficult. If not perhaps a dynamic that can't work. And part of it is Turkey, the European Union's conversation with Turkey now is largely in an accession context. The European Commission entity that owns Turkey, if you could use that word, is the Enlargement Directorate. But a lot of the issues that Turkey and the EU have to talk about are not enlargement issues. It's like the Middle East, in Libya, in Iraq, in Iran, in the Caucasus, in the Balkans, in Afghanistan. There are a whole bunch of things that do not fall within the responsibilities of the EU, European Commission, the European Commissioner for Enlargement, Stefan Füle. Those issues belong to Catherine Ashton. And yet, just the way that the conversation is set up, you're not going to have a very effective conversation about those issues because Füle is not sort of the right guy. And I think one of the things, and there I think is starting to be a conversation about this in European capitals, that there need to be 2 sets of conversations going on. One is the accession conversation. That's important and problematic because of the hold that's been put on so many of the chapters that, effectively speaking, can't really be talked about. But then a separate conversation that's a more strategic one and a more foreign policy conversation that ends up being more Davutoglu to Catherine Ashton as opposed to Egemen Baş and Stefan Füle. And that's a tricky conversation to have because Turkish authorities don't want in any way to see diminution of interest in the accession conversation for obvious reasons, because you can pretty quickly talk about privileged partnership as opposed to membership. But it's a conversation that's got to take place. So I think it's now been established a sort of 4x4 or a 2+2 conversation. Ashton, Davutoglu, Egemen, and Füle, Egemen Baş and Füle, that sort of meet together and talk about strategic things. I think the European Union has also decided to invite Foreign Minister Davutoglu to, in sort of a structured way that the European has, it's 26 or whatever the current number of the EU, I think it's 26 plus 1, that meet to discuss strategic issues. That's a set of conversations that I think is going to have to develop, and that can contribute to maybe more appreciation of a better understanding of ways that the EU on the one hand and Turkey on the other can work together effectively. Maybe also a conversation or a better understanding of the limits of the ways that they can work together effectively. But anyway, pursuing that conversation outside the accession context, I think is going to be an increasingly important thing, particularly given that the accession conversation at best is one that will be resolved only in a whole lot of years, maybe a decade or two or maybe more.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your presentation. You have talked about the profound changes and you have identified basically three broad areas, the migration issues, the economic transformation, and the changes in the political situation. Most of them, all of these in three areas, there are various aspects to that. The question that is being debated in various circles is that to what extent are these profound changes, are these here to stay? Or to what extent that developments in the future might change the course? How does the, I mean, to what, this is